Just a quick question. How many of you have seen Bob on YouTube? That's how I first met Bob. He didn't meet me, I met him, and I learned a whole lot about Bob from watching him on YouTube. And then I had the opportunity to meet him in person earlier this year and spent some time with Bob in the last day. So it's been really interesting, and one of the things that I can say is that Bob has done just about everything you can do in the bee business. Bob's done it. And there's an old saying that says, you try everything once, and if you like it, you try it again. And I think Bob probably has done that. He's been pollinating, he's raised bees. I don't think there's anything really that he hasn't done. To give you an example, one of the topics that we thought would be really interesting to you, because after all, are any of you interested in having honey? I know Amy is. And there's some special things about honey, and Bob's an expert on honey. Just to give you an example, last year, Bob sold 1.5 million pounds of honey. He knows honey. The other thing that I found out about Bob, and I was really impressed, was the fact the depth of his knowledge. He really is knowledgeable about the bee business and also about his sincerity, willingness to share that knowledge. So, if you will, Bob Binnie.
Can I move? Yeah, perfect, thank you. Well, if I wasn't nervous before, now I am. Do you ever get nervous when, you've been doing crowds a long time. Do you still today get nervous when you get in front of a crowd? Yeah, it usually takes me a few minutes of talking to just kind of settle the nerves down, be cool, and start getting to the subject matter. So I have a little trick, and I actually learned it from Jennifer Berry. Some of you know who that lady is. She works for the University of Georgia. She runs the bee lab, and she says, Bob, just tell a joke that you have memorized before you start, and it'll help the nerves fall down, and it'll warm the crowd up. So I'm going to do that. And I need to find, let's see. Ma'am, what is your name? Right in front of me, right there, you. Sharon. Sharon, would you be offended if I told a dumb blonde joke? Okay. Thank you. It's simple. I read it in Reader's Digest, but it's fun. And of course, it could be a dumb brunette joke. It could be a dumb redhead joke. It doesn't matter. But there was this nice young couple living up north, and they were both in the kitchen having breakfast, and the newsman came on and reported that it was going to snow that night, and it was going to snow probably 6 inches, and he asked that everybody move their cars to the side of the street with the odd numbered addresses so the snowplow could get through. So she immediately got up, went out, and moved the car to the odd side of the street, while her husband watched this with a kind of perplexed attitude. And when she came back in, she could see the look on his face, and she's like, what? He said odd side, and he said, husband left it alone, no comment. So a week later, the same newsman comes on and says, folks, it's going to snow 6 inches tonight, but tonight I want everybody to move their cars to the even side of the street. Move your car to the side of the street with even numbered addresses. So right away, she got up, she went out, and she moved her car to the even side of the street. Same routine with the husband. He was just shaking his head, and she came in and said, what? What is the issue? He said, nah, it's nothing. So sure enough, a week later, same newsman comes on while they're having breakfast, and he says, folks, you're not going to believe it, but we're going to have another snow tonight of around 6 inches, and I want you to all move your cars and the electricity went out. And she couldn't hear what he was about to say about which side of the street to move the car to. And she was quite perplexed. She paced the kitchen. She didn't know what to do, and she was mumbling to herself. And finally, her husband spoke up, and he said, honey, why don't you just leave the car in the garage this time? That's my dumb blonde. That's my dumb blonde joke. It's clean, you can tell it to anybody, right? I've got some other jokes that I won't tell here. So this beekeeping event, I've been going to beekeeping meetings since 1981. That's when I started, that's when I got involved in beekeeping. Been going to meetings all over the country since then. This one does have a little bit different feel. I really got to say that. And one word comes to mind, and I don't know if this is a good word for you or not, but I think of the word grace, okay? I think there's a little bit of grace at work here. And I think grace is at work in all of our lives so much, and we don't think about it, don't realize it, take it for granted. It just has a little bit of a feel of grace going on right here. So, Al, you gave me a real good introduction. I hope I can live up to it. We do indeed process a lot of honey, 1.5 million pounds, like he said. We have about 20 employees. I am a beekeeper first and foremost, and this honey packing thing just kind of came along by accident. I guess it might have been 15 years ago. I had a very bad year and made almost no honey. And I was still in a position where I had to make honey. I had property payments, truck payments, had to make honey, either that or go get a job somewhere. And a friend of mine down in South Georgia said, well, why don't you just get some honey from me and take it home and try to sell it? And I did. I took my 3/4 ton pickup down to South Georgia and got 6 drums of honey and brought them up home and bottled them. And right away, something happened. I had a bad year, but guess what? Everybody in my area had a bad year too. And there was a shortage of honey labeled with a Georgia address. And in the mountains where we live, there's kind of a tourist thing going on, and people come through wanting to buy honey with a Georgia address, and it wasn't available. And it just sold like hotcakes real fast. And I had this aha light bulb moment, you know. I realized that I could probably keep buying and selling honey. And so I was kind of forced out of necessity just to survive into this honey packing thing. The first 3 years I was in business in Georgia, I actually hit the road, knocked on doors, went to gift shops, stores, wherever I could. Anybody that I thought would sell honey, I would visit them and try to peddle my product. And that was a very long time ago. And after the first 3 years, I've not knocked on a single door. I've not made a single phone call. And all of this business has come to me. Every single year, we grow 10 to 15%. And I don't do anything to cause that growth except for provide a quality product and provide good service. And I think that just takes care of the rest. And that's all of you that feel like you want to move into this, or maybe you already are in business as a honey packer, beekeeper, honey producer, honey packer. I really think if you just do the best you can, that grace will provide the rest, okay? You just do the best you can, and the doors will open for you. And I feel very strongly about that. I feel that's why we are successful. And another reason I feel like we've been successful is that life presents these questions. Constantly you have an opportunity where you can either say yes or you can say no. I loved what she said, because that's been what's part of our success. Every time we had an opportunity, even if it felt like we were biting off more than I could chew, I would say yes. I would bite off more than I could chew, and then I'd figure out how to chew it. And that was another part of our success. We're doing well now. Thankfully, just in the last few years, I feel like if I want a new car, I can actually buy one and pay for it. It's been a long time coming, but I think all the work is paid off, and we're finally in a position where I feel like I'm successful. And the bees and the honey and all of that has done it for me. So this morning in the hotel, I went downstairs and got quiet and by myself, and I was going to take this article I wrote 3 years ago, and Gene heard me talk about this 3 years ago in Kentucky, and he asked me to actually speak to this club year before last, and of course COVID took care of that. And this morning I went downstairs to take this article and just make some notes and bullet points where I could hit the bullet points and talk about it. There's too many bullet points in this article, so I just brought the whole thing. I just highlighted a lot of stuff. And I'm going to parallel this article. It's called, if you want to write this down, it's called Processing Honey, A Closer Look. And it was published in Bee Culture magazine 3 or 4 years ago. The article is much better than what I'm going to present to you today, because when I wrote the article, if I didn't like what I just said, I could push delete and write it again. Today I don't have that option. So you're going to have to bear with me, and hopefully it'll go okay. Okay, for starters, there's a lot of diet fads out there today, right? I mean, there's just an endless amount of diets. And a lot of them are about no sugar, and that's legitimate. I mean, sugar in most cases is pretty bad for us, I can tell you. But honey gets lumped into this no sugar category. Honey, they say, is just another sugar, but that's not true. Honey is different. Honey has been studied a lot, both medically, scientifically. It's been found to have over 180 substances in it. It has a lot of medicinal properties, and some of these substances allow our system to process honey differently than other carbohydrates, and that's important. You might hear or have read a lot of athletes today are using some form of honey to help them perform in an athletic situation. I read about actually a lady who did quite well in long distance running in the Olympics some time ago, and she had powdered honey, dried honey, slipped in a little packet in her belt, and every once in a while she'd take a little thing of this dried honey and a sip of water. People were handing her bottles of water along the way, and she said that's what helped her win gold. It kept her energy up. And so, sugar is an important part of our diet. We just have to be careful how we handle it. Honey is not just another sugar. That's the bottom line of this message here. And how good honey is for us doesn't just depend on how we use it. It also depends on how we process it and how we store it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because there's a lot of bad information out there. There's a lot of things that are misunderstood. Imagine this: the internet is full of half-truths and wrong information. So we're going to talk about some of those today. And again, I'm just following the article, so if you want to download, and it is online. If you Google it, it just comes right up. I think it's getting read widely, oddly enough, and it comes right up if you type the title in. Okay, first and foremost is temperature. Temperature and the effects on honey. Most operations, I would guess that almost everybody here that handles honey is using the effects of temperature to some extent, whether they realize it or not. Cold honey won't pour. Cold honey is hard to bottle. So even if you're just trying to warm your honey up to room temperature or a little bit warmer, you're using some form of temperature to enhance your ability to bottle. Big packers, of course, are heating it up quite hot so it can run through pipes and, pumps and things like that. So we're going to talk about the effects of temperature on honey. Both hot and cold. People don't think about cold, so there's something interesting there too. The first thing that is affected by temperature that comes to my mind is enzymes. Enzymes are an important part of our food, whether we realize it or not. They're taken for granted. They're being studied, highly studied these days, and I think people are just starting to realize how important enzymes are to us as humans and in our food source. And I'm going to quote Merriam-Webster. I'm going to read it from the article because I'll never get this right if I don't. Merriam-Webster Dictionary says enzymes are complex proteins produced by living cells that catalyze or increase the rate of biochemical reactions. I know that's a lot of information. To put it in simplistic terms, you can think of enzymes as energy that help things change. Okay? It's a catalyst. And the presence of active enzymes in honey are part of what defines raw honey. If you do not have enzyme activity present in your honey, personally I feel like you can't really define it as raw. There's other parts of raw honey too, and we'll talk about that later as we go through this. That would be particles and yeast and things like that. There's a number of enzymes in honey, most very minor, almost non-existent, but they're in just a little bit. But there's three major enzymes in honey that need our attention. And oddly enough, the bees actually put these enzymes in the honey, and this is Mother Nature at her best, because the bees are putting these enzymes there for a purpose. They all have a reason. The first enzyme that comes to mind, and is probably most familiar to us, would be the enzyme invertase. Okay, invertase does something interesting. Invertase in honey, well, first of all, let me back up. Nectar comes in as primarily sucrose. There's very little other types of honey and nectar. It's mostly sucrose. The problem with sucrose is that it's not as soluble as fructose and dextrose and maltose, which are the other three major sugars in honey. Because it's not as soluble, you can't condense it into a solid enough form, or I should say, it can't be as dense of a supersaturated solution as can fructose, maltose, and dextrose. So if you put invertase in there, it will invert sucrose to fructose and dextrose. So then the bees can concentrate it down below that magic 18.5% moisture, so it won't ferment, so it won't spoil. That's the purpose of invertase, is to make the honey more storable, if you will. Okay? Let's see if I'm missing anything about invertase. Yeah, it just helps make the honey more stable. This is kind of a side note, and it's really not about honey, it's about bees. I often say this, I ask this question at a beekeeping meeting, and I will just say, what's the favorite food of bees? And people will raise their hand and say honey. That's incorrect. Honey is not the favorite food of bees. Fresh nectar is. This sucrose nectar coming in is the favorite food of bees. They're just changing it into something that they can put in the pantry and it'll stay good till they get around to it. Much like we would can something or freeze something, okay? Honey is not the best food for bees. Fresh nectar is. That's something that surprises many people. We could go on a whole nother rant about that and feeding and sugar and all of that. I could do a whole meeting on just that. We won't get into that here. The next enzyme that's really important is glucose oxidase. Glucose oxidase helps stabilize honey by producing make sure I get this right. It creates a chemical reaction which creates gluconic acid. The presence of gluconic acid in honey lowers the pH to around an average of 3.9. If you put anything down to 3.9, it becomes antimicrobial, antibacterial. It makes it more stable, gives it, it's more stable, less spoiling. And oddly enough, an interesting byproduct of glucose oxidase producing gluconic acid is hydrogen peroxide. So now we suddenly have hydrogen peroxide in our honey in small amounts that also is highly antimicrobial, highly antibacterial. And it's really, the presence of hydrogen peroxide is what makes honey one of the things, I should say, that makes honey so good on wounds and burns and things like that. And there's something magical in my mind that occurs in this instance that I'm not sure you can duplicate in a laboratory. I once asked a chemist if he could, and he said, no, I don't think I can. When let's see, how do I say this? When glucose oxidase is producing gluconic acid, when it reaches that pH of 3.9, it stops producing gluconic acid. But if you raise the moisture content, and raise the pH, it will once again, as long as it's intact, will once again begin to produce gluconic acid, hence hydrogen peroxide. Well, think about what happens when you put it on your skin. You raise the pH because of the fluid and the salinity in your body. You thin it out because of the fluids on your wound, and it once again starts to produce this hydrogen peroxide. And a chemist told me, he says, I don't think I can do that in a laboratory. So honey is very magical in this respect. And I think it's one of the gifts of the honeybee. I'm a big proponent of apitherapy. If anybody's seen my video, a couple videos ago, they know that. I just have gotten over a case of the shingles. Pretty good case too, I should say. And I got really smart and wise and tried some apitherapy, bee sting therapy on my shingles. And I got to be careful how I say this. I'm not telling you all that this is going to cure you of shingles. My experience with that is that it really helped me. I really believe in bee sting therapy. I believe in honey therapy and pollen and propolis especially. So if you're talking about apitherapy, I'm a big proponent of all that. And this falls right into that. Honey on a wound. In Europe, they're starting, you can actually go into a pharmacy in a hospital in many places in Europe and ask for gauze with honey impregnated in it, and you will get it. We're a little off here. It takes us a little longer sometimes in this country to catch up to some of these home remedies, but I think eventually you're going to see honey used extensively in wound care, burn care especially, things like that. There's less scarring. Your wound heals quicker. It's really interesting. I don't understand it all, but I do know there's something there. So the next enzyme is diastase. Diastase converts starch to sugar. But the reason I'm kind of familiar with diastase is because before they came up with some of these more modern ways of testing honey to see if it's been exposed to too much heat or anything, is diastase, the activity of diastase is very easy to measure in a laboratory. So decades ago, honey packers, especially in Europe, would measure the activity of diastase to see if the honey they were purchasing had been overheated or exposed to too much heat. So I read an article that probably 20 years ago about a study that was produced in Germany, and I still remember the numbers, and I put it in my article. The activity of enzymes is measured by its half-life, which I guess basically means how much life is left at how do I say it? I actually wrote it. Let me see if I can quote myself in this. The effects of heat on an enzyme are commonly measured by the time it takes to reduce half of the enzyme's activity or its half-life at a given temperature. Okay, now I know the rest. In this German study, they measured the activity of diastase, and they found out that at 68 degrees, the half-life was 1,000 days. In other words, even at 68 degrees, the enzyme activity in honey was deteriorating. And then they raised the temperature up to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a pretty common temperature for us as beekeepers, in processing and things like that. And they found out that the half-life was 2 weeks. And then they they put the temperature up to 176 and found out that the half-life was 30 seconds, okay? So if you're a big honey producer and a big honey packer, and you're using what is typically the process and heat your honey to 140 to 160 for other reasons that we'll talk about, I'm going to say it in French terms, and forgive me, you just killed the hell out of the enzymes in that honey, okay? Does that make sense? Now, all the enzymes are affected similarly. So when you go on the internet and you read that somebody states that 104 degrees kills the enzyme in honey, it's a half-truth. It's an equation. It has to do with time and temperature. Okay, so you can even kill the enzymes in honey if you put it above your refrigerator where it's 85 degrees. In time, you're going to kill the enzymes in your honey. Now, very odd, if you go on the internet and you read about temperature in honey, this was really puzzling to me. I saw over and over the same statement. It's kind of like people copied and pasted the same statement, and they said that putting honey in your refrigerator was bad for it. That's absolutely incorrect, because the colder you store honey, the less it deteriorates. If you store honey below freezing, it barely deteriorates at all. So that's a misstatement, one of those things on the internet that you need to ignore. Let's see. flavor, aroma, and color are part of what we use as indicators that tell us the quality of honey. Flavor for sure, right? Aroma, good quality honey has a smell. You can almost smell it before you taste it. That's an interesting thing. And 20 or 30 years ago, color was an indicator too. If it was very dark, people would say, oh, that's not good honey. These days we realize that that's completely untrue, that the darker honeys are possibly the better for you, because what gives honey a dark color is its mineral content. Buckwheat, tulip poplar are very good examples of that. Do y'all have a lot of tulip poplar in this neighborhood? I'll bet you do. We have a lot in our area, and when it produces well, I'd rather have me a good jar of tulip poplar than blackberry or clover. I really would. I love that tulip poplar, that molassesy flavor. I love it. And I see the blackberries blooming and the clover blooming, and that's all wonderful honey, but give me a jar of tulip poplar any day. We also produce sourwood in our neighborhood too, which I think is even better than that. It's not dark, but boy, it's sure good. That's a separate subject. So here's something interesting. I read a study about color and how it deteriorates with temperature. If you freeze honey, put it below freezing, the color barely changes at all. But as you raise the temperature of the honey, every 10 degrees that you raise the temperature of the honey, the rate at which the color changes triples. Now the difference between freezing and 42 degrees, that rate is very small. But when you go from 42 to 52, whatever it did change, you've tripled it. Now some honeys darken much quicker than others. Sourwood darkens very quick in my view. Orange blossom is another one. Saw palmetto out of Florida. They both also darken very quickly. One that darkens very slowly would be Tupelo, and there's others too. Blackberry doesn't darken very fast. I don't think black locust darkens very fast, but whatever that rate is, as you raise the temperature every 10 degrees, you are tripling that. And the deterioration of aroma and the deterioration of taste also occur at almost the same rate. Isn't that interesting? So the best way to kill, or best way to keep honey, is to freeze it. And not only that, and we're going to talk about crystallization in a bit too, it's very slow to crystallize at very cold temperatures, and if you get it cold enough, it will never crystallize. I'm going to save that information for a little later. Let's see, got through that. Oh, I want to back up and say something. We've gotten off of enzymes, but I don't want to miss this one. If you liquefy honey in a microwave, it also kills the enzymes really fast. So I know it's really easy to put the jar of honey in the microwave and liquefy it, but you're better off not to use the microwave if you can help it when you're liquefying your honey. Let's see. Okay, well, actually, I'm going to back up to enzymes again and temperature. A lot of people say if you heat your honey at all, that you can no longer call it raw, but there's a little bit of an argument with Mother Nature there. I know in this part of Tennessee that in the middle of summer in the top super, surely the top bars in that super are getting 100, 110, depending on what cover you're using, maybe 120. So just in the beehive, your honey is already deteriorating, and that's another reason why fresh honey is better for you. I always tell my customers, if you're unable to freeze your honey and hold it, that fresh is best. Now, another curious note about enzymes is if you freeze it, the enzymes stop deteriorating and the activity stops. But once you warm it back up to room temperature, the enzyme activity comes back again. Isn't that interesting? I would have never guessed that till I read it, that the enzymes stay intact, but the activity stops when you freeze honey. Let's see, materials and processing. This is interesting. A lot of people don't really have a good handle on this, I don't think. Because of honey's acidity, it reacts with almost everything, even stainless steel, honestly. It reacts with most metals dramatically. That would be steel, iron, tin, copper, aluminum especially. If you were to put your honey in an aluminum vessel and somehow magically be able to weigh the honey when it went in and weigh the honey when it came out, you would find that your vessel lost weight and that your honey gained weight. It's etching the metal, it's etching the material, and it does that with plastic too. I think if you're going to store honey long term, the best thing you can store it in is probably glass. And that's not always ideal. It even etches stainless steel, but stainless steel is etched at such a minor degree that it's really our best choice for tanks and processing equipment and stuff like that. Zinc especially, galvanized metal, the old extractors from 40 years ago that were galvanized metal. I can remember, honey being been at this 40 years, I can remember honey being stored in a galvanized tank and actually wondered, this tastes a little odd. I wonder if it picked up something from the galvanized metal, and now I know that it's true that it did. There's only two metals that it really doesn't etch, and that is silver and gold. But I don't think we're going to make our storage tanks out of silver or gold anytime soon. So, plastic, you have to pay attention. If it's not food grade, don't go there. It needs to be food grade plastic. The best plastic for storing or holding honey in, if you're going to sell it, if you have to or feel the need to use plastic, is, I can't even pronounce the word. I'm going to spell it to you. It's, see if I can find it here. It's polyethylene, TEREPHTHALATE. Pronounce that fast 3 times. I don't even know how to pronounce it once. We know it as PET plastic, PET or PETE. We usually see it as PET. Most of the water bottles I see out there are PET plastic. That's the clear plastic. And when you're looking at a food container, you can turn it upside down and you'll see a triangle on the bottom, and that triangle has a number 1 on it. The next most common plastic, which is what milk jugs are made of, and we commonly see it in skeps or something like that, is high density polyethylene, HDPE. That's a very common plastic. And it has a number 2 in the triangle. Now, I have to admit that I don't really know if you get a number 8 or a number 9 or a 7 what that really means, but I do know that those are the 2 plastics that are most desirable if you're going to use plastic. A food grade bucket, if you turn it upside down, she might have some jars or buckets over here. If you turn those upside down, you should see a number 2 in the triangle, so that's important. You to use food grade. If it's not food grade, the honey can etch it easily, and you can actually get the taste of plastic. Orange juice is another one that really needs to be in the right plastic, very acidic. It can etch the plastic and you can taste the plastic in your orange juice. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah. Glass is best. And it's kind of funny, when we put containers of honey, we have a lot of grocery stores. I haven't even counted them lately. We might have honey in 500 grocery stores, and we have 85 Walmarts around Atlanta. We have 213 Kroger stores. And we also are in many other, several other major grocery store chains under other people's labels. We co-pack for other people too. We must be in 500 stores. And in almost every store, if you put glass beside plastic, the plastic will outsell the glass 4 or 5 to 1, in some places 10 to 1. And I get it. I mean, if I was a mother and had 3 small children, you wouldn't catch me buying a quart jar. I mean, I'd buy the squeeze bear or something like that. You almost have to keep, injury at a minimum there. Some grocery stores won't buy it in glass. If you break honey or molasses or any kind of syrup, if you break that glass door inside the grocery store, they've got a serious mess to clean up. And so some stores won't even purchase honey in a glass jar. So the next biggie, I need to be careful with time. Do I have to worry about time at all? This could go on for a little while, so I need to know whether to move quickly or not. 20 minutes? Okay, I think we can cover this all in 20 minutes. Moisture is a biggie. People so much misunderstand honey and moisture. It's not a big deal in arid areas like Southern California or Arizona, but in this area, and especially where I live in Rabun County, northeasterly Georgia, it is a big deal. Honey is hygroscopic, hygro with a G, scopic. In a nutshell, that means that it will In very humid instances, it will pull moisture out of the air and it will gain weight. It will gain volume, gain weight, it'll pull moisture in. It's also hydrophilic, which means in a very dry atmosphere, it will do just the opposite. It will lose moisture, it will lose weight. And we as beekeepers can use that to our advantage. And what I see occurring over and over and over as a medium-sized packer buying honey from other beekeepers, I'm always puzzled to see somebody extracting honey in an environment that is humid, especially in Georgia. I don't know what the humidity is here today. I'm guessing 50% right now, maybe, might be 40, somewhere between 40 and 60. And that can be problematic. If you harvest, transport, store, on cap, and extract, and then store in a tank, honey in a humid environment, you are gaining water the whole way. And in some cases, it can be dramatic and it can be problematic. And a lot of people think, well, I waited till it was all capped. I don't know why it's fermenting on me now. Well, that can be part of the reason. And we can use that to this idea of hydrophilic, we can use that to our advantage. We actually put our honey supers in a drying room when we bring them home. We have two big dehumidifiers in a room that's, I guess it's about 30 by 40 with a high ceiling, and we have industrial fans in the ceiling blowing straight down into the stacks of supers. And these dehumidifiers get the room up to about 85 or 90 degrees, get the moisture way down, the relative humidity down around 20 or 25%. And we actually purposely pull our honey before it's 100% capped, because it's the on-capped portion that's being affected the quickest or the most dramatic. Now, against common beliefs, honey or moisture will migrate through beeswax cappings. It's just extremely slow. So you can dry honey out that's capped in one of these types of rooms, but it just takes a long time. We'll pull our supers in when they're a third. You can just see the bees are just capping it all off. Maybe it's a third from being finished, and we'll leave them in that room for about 3 days. And the uncapped portion, which might have been 18 or so, or 18 and a half, just in those 3 days will drop way down to 13 or 14. And then when you extract the honey, it all blends together and you come up with something that might be 16 or 17. I like honey that's between 16 and 17% moisture. I think it has a more defined flavor. I think it's higher quality. It's obviously more stable. It'll stay on the shelf much longer. It has more character. I just think it makes a better product. And although the bees may not have got it I guess we're tinkering with Mother Nature a little bit here, but why not? If we were in Arizona, it'd fall right down to 13 all by itself. The people out west don't even consider this problem, or this thing as being a problem. Kind of a funny side note, Suzette, my wife right there, we were visiting her family out in Riverside, California. I don't know if you remember this or not. It was very dry. I was born in California. I'm familiar with LA. That's where I was born. And coming here was kind of a shock to my system. I remember when I got off the plane in Atlanta to visit a friend, I got off the plane and in 10 seconds I said, okay, that's what humidity feels like. I did not know up until then. Anyway, we were visiting her family, and her brother, Bruce, nice guy, smart guy too, and we were all sweating. It was October, and it was 101 degrees. Welcome to Riverside, California. It's right on the edge of the Mojave Desert, And he said, man, it's humid. He would wipe the sweat off. I thought, this ain't humidity. I knew better than that, and I got out my phone. It's Riverside, California, 7% humidity. You know what that does to honey, right? It dries it out just like that. Just driving the truck home, you've just taken a bunch of moisture out, Here, it's just the opposite. We have to be very mindful of this humidity situation. So, moisture is a big deal, and it's going to move us into probably our next, let's see what's next up here. Yeah, we're going to get into yeast next, and moisture and yeast, there's an equation there too. Everything about honey and processing and storing and deterioration and spoilage and all of that, there's always an equation. It's never just one number about anything. There's always this time, temperature thing going on. It's an equation. And as beekeepers, we have to be mindful of that and be able to figure out, manipulate the situation in our favor. And that's what these drying rooms do. You don't need a big room like I do. You can do it in a closet. You can do it in a small room. You can, in your garage, you can just drape down some clear plastic, make a little square, put a little cheap dehumidifier in there from Walmart, turn on a fan up above, and you'll pull just as much moisture out as I do. And why not? Why not make it even better? Well, I just noticed that there's some numbers involved here that I forgot to give that's important. At 50% humidity, if the honey is exposed continuously to that humidity, it will eventually equalize with that environment at 15.9% moisture, which in my view is a wonderful place to be. No honey will ferment at that moisture content. If you have 60, just 10% higher in relative humidity, at 60% humidity, if you expose it continuously, it will equalize at 18.6, which is what the books tell us is the magic place to be where it won't ferment. That's not always true. We're going to get into another equation here in a minute. If you put your honey and expose it continuously at 80% humidity, the equalization number goes all the way up to 33.1%. So you can see how important it is to keep your honey away from this humidity. Very important. No honey will ferment at 15.9, but I guarantee you, if you haven't heated the honey up and killed the yeast in it at 33.1, you're going to be blowing the lids off your jar. So that moves us into yeast, which is, let me back up. I keep seeing things on my list here that I need to mention. I'm so glad I have the article. I would have forgot half of this stuff. If you need to remove moisture from your honey, you have to be mindful that honey has a very slow diffusion rate, which means, for example, like if you get a bucket or a barrel or a tank, whatever, of honey, and you get your room dried out and you blow a fan across the honey to try to dry it out, it only really affects the top quarter inch or half inch. It won't move, that effect won't move down into the vessel. Now, if you stir it continuously, it will. That changes the whole scenario. So don't be thinking you're just going to blow a fan across your bucket and dry the honey out very fast. It'll take a very long time unless you get in there and stir it often. Also know that warm air always has a lower relative humidity than cool air. Relative humidity is, how do I explain that? Relative humidity is the amount of moisture that the air is able to hold at a given temperature. Like if you're at 60% relative humidity, that means the air is 60% saturated before the moisture will begin to drop out. The warmer the air gets, the lower that saturation number goes. Like, I don't know that this is exactly true, but if it was 80 degrees and the humidity was 50%, if you raised it to 100 degrees and didn't do anything, sealed room, that humidity would drop down to, I don't know what, 20 or 30% simply by raising the temperature. So not only can you use a dehumidifier to pull moisture out, but you can also warm the air up, and that'll have an effect also. It's best to do both. 85, 90 degrees, dry air, you'll pull moisture out real fast. Yeast. Boy, that's so misunderstood. The yeast in honey is not the same yeast that you see in beer, wine, bread, things like that. The yeast in honey is able to tolerate these high sugar concentrations that we find in honey. And the nectar does not inherently have yeast in it. The bees pick it up on everything they touch. The soil, the flowers, yeast is everywhere. It's here. It's on this piano right here. It's on the microphone. Yeast is absolutely everywhere, and we have to be mindful of that. And the yeast that survives in honey tolerates this very high sugar concentration that honey has. And most books and most lecturers will tell you that you need to keep your honey below 18.6% moisture. But now we're about to get into another equation. It has to do with temperature, moisture, and yeast cell content, or yeast spore, I'm sorry. Yeast spores in a laboratory are commonly measured in how many spores there are per gram of honey. Honey that has a very low yeast spore content, like say 1 or 2 or 3 per gram, you can run it all the way up to 19% moisture and it won't ferment. But if you have a yeast spore content of around 10 or 12 per gram, that's where you fall into this 18.6 realm. And honestly, most honeys fall in there. But there are a number of honeys that go much, much higher than that. If you get up to around 1,000 spores in a gram, it's going to ferment on you even down around 18 or 17.5. As a honey purchaser, I found this out the hard way. A few years ago, I purchased some honey out of Florida called cabbage palm. I got the sample from the man, a trusted producer. We're friends. I trusted him completely. I got the sample. It tasted great. The moisture was 17.5. Never would have believed it would ever in 1,000 years ferment, so I bought a semi-load of it. It sat there for about 2 months before we started to get around to using it. Guess what was happening? I caught my eye. I looked over at those drums one day, and the lids that came in kind of concave were now the other way. They were ballooned up, and I thought something's very wrong here. Went over and tapped on the drum. It was tight as a drum. It was just, tink, tink, tink. Sure enough, it was fermenting on me at 17.5. Now, mangrove honey is just the opposite. I purchased some mangrove honey at 19%. The man assured me, and his dad was a huge packer, so I figured he knew what he was talking about. He said mangrove won't ferment it at 19, and he was correct. We had some of those drums as long as 6 months. Never did ferment. We didn't heat it. We didn't do anything. Now, if you have thin honey and you've got to figure out what to do with it, you can use either heat or cold to deal with it. If you heat the honey up hot enough, you will kill the yeast. I actually have those numbers. I'm not going to try to do that one off the top of my head. At 125 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast will be dead in 8 hours. In other words, if you heat your honey up to 125 overnight, it will be pasteurized in the morning. At 145, which is the realm where a lot of large packers use, 140 to 160, it's dead in 30 minutes. If you heat it up to 176, let me make sure I got this right, 160 they say, it's dead in 3 minutes. So you can use heat to kill the yeast. Of course, what else have you done? You've just killed all of the enzymes in your honey. You've deteriorated the taste. Just go right down the list. You've just hurt your honey. But if you can store your honey below 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the activity of the yeast ceases and it won't ferment. So if on a personal level, if you have honey that's too thin, just store it in the refrigerator. It'll never ferment, and then you can take it out as you need it. As a big packer, I got to use that phrase carefully. I'm not a big packer. I'm kind of, in the big scheme of things, we're kind of mediocre in size. As a beekeeper, the numbers are staggering to me, but when I go to meetings where I see large packers, I'm a little peon. So, but as somebody who buys honey and packs honey a lot, and have learned a lot the hard way, we actually rent space in a local food bank. They have a huge cooler. It's almost the size of this building, and they'll rent us space monthly. They charge us by the pallet, $20 a month for a pallet. How cheap can that be? This last winter, we put all our supers in there. I don't use wax moth crystals or anything like that. I just store my supers in this cooler, and we have no problem. At that price, it's kind of a no-brainer. But if I get honey that's too thin and I don't have time to deal with it right away, it goes straight to the cooler, and then I can deal with it later. The way we deal with it is we don't try to pasteurize it. We try to blend it with other honeys that are thicker. When we do a batch of honey, it's always 31 drums. So I can put 1 or 2 or 3, whatever it happens to be, depending on the moisture content. I can put those drums with some thicker honey, and they come out in our blend. Most of the honey that we sell to grocery stores is blended honey. We can't always have the same taste and the same color, but we try to get in the neighborhood. And the way we do that is by taking darks and lights and strongs and milds and kind of making a blend. Well, I can slip in a drum of something that's too thin, or maybe 2 or 3, and it just disappears in there if I've got honey that's 16 or 17% moisture. That's how we deal with it. Okay, let's see. And also, again, I says right in my article, I say, be warned, if you think that killing the yeast in thin honey with heat will solve all of your problems, you better think again, because yeast is everywhere, and the moment you open that container, it is once again at risk. You can bottle it hot, and it'll be safe until somebody opens the lid. Then it can once again be exposed to yeast that's everywhere and ferment on them. Let's see, 52 degrees, crystallized honey. We're getting closer to the end. I hope we're doing good. 5 minutes, that's all? My goodness. I'm never going to hit all this in 5 minutes. Sorry about that. But crystallization is interesting. The reason honey crystallizes is the dextrose content. Honeys that crystallize quickly, like black locust, crystallizes pretty quick in my view. Black locust has a high percentage of dextrose. Honeys that are very slow to crystallize, which tulip poplar would be one. The ones that won't crystallize at all are things like sourwood, tupelo, black sage from California. Those are the only three I know of. Honeys that are below 20%, well, I'll say below 25% dextrose will never crystallize, but if they get as high as 40% dextrose, they'll start crystallizing before we're done having this meeting. Honeys like that are canola, tai-tai, cotton honey can be pretty bad too. I harvested a crop. I harvested a crop of canola honey once, and we were extracting, and I took the weekend off, and when I came back after 2 days away, it was setting up in the sump tank, the pump, the pipes. It was a big nightmare. Very interesting stuff, canola honey. Honey that is low in dextrose will, even if it does crystallize, it'll be just kind of milky and soft. And if it has a high degree of dextrose, that's the one that gets so hard you can tap your knuckles on them. And then also the dextrose in honey will convert to other sugars over time. I'm sure some of you ran across a jar of honey that was 10 years old in your grandfather's pantry, and the bottom looked kind of gritty and the top had gone liquid but dark again. That's because the dextrose had converted to other sugars over time. I'm going to skip over some stuff. Go to the article, download it. I'm missing some stuff here. I do want to get on this filtration thing though, because filtration is another segment where it really defines whether honey is raw or not, and grossly misunderstood. Okay, again. Honey, and I'm going to quote this, honey labeled U.S. grade A fancy, quote, must be free of defects that affect appearance and may not contain particles that can affect clarity. In other words, in order to call something USDA grade A fancy, you can't see anything in it. My honey does not qualify for that. That honey back there on the table probably would. That's really clean, very clear honey. And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to insult somebody before I'm done here. I don't like to see honey that clean because I think you've filtered out everything, not everything, you filtered out much of what makes honey special. And although that's very lovely, might win an award in a honey show, I think you've taken something out of it. I'm a proponent of raw honey. I want to see stuff in my honey. I don't want to see dead bees, splinters, nails, and all that stuff. But I like to see our honey all has that foam on top, and that's the good stuff. Tastes like taffy if you taste it by itself. It's really good tasting. Now, okay, I'm talking about me. I'm done insulting somebody, whoever did that. Forgive me, I'm so sorry. But there's also reasons for doing that. When you make honey look like that, it is very attractive on the shelf to consumers. It's also going to crystallize slower because if you take all the particles, including a dust particle out of honey, you've just removed all the platforms from which the crystals can begin they need something to start with. Many raw honeys, the day you extract it, it has these little things floating around. I call them seed crystals. If you look at it under a microscope, it looks like cornflakes or snowflakes floating around there. That's little crystals that they're already there, and that's like the platform from which the crystallization thing can start. And of course, if you heat your honey up real hot, you erase all of that, and it makes it last longer without crystallizing. But particles of dust and pollen and beeswax can also be platforms from which the sugar can start start to bind to and create that crystallization problem. So honey that clean is going to have a longer life without crystallizing. So there are pros to something like that. And if you're sous vide and your honey has to go through a warehouse for a month and on a store shelf for 2 months, that might be what you need to do so it'll get sold, because crystallized honey is not very attractive to the average consumer, although we as beekeepers understand that that's okay. That's quite fine. I don't mind crystallized honey. It doesn't run off my peanut butter toast. I mean, I like crystallized honey, okay? Okay, so let's talk about filtering and what works and what doesn't work. Some people say if you filter it at all, you cannot call it raw anymore. I try to kind of fall in between the don't filter it at all and filter it completely communities, if you want to put it that way. We filter our honey with a very coarse filter. We use an 800 or 1,000 micron filter. What I don't want, and I got to admit, I love the honey straight out of the extractor. It's so good. I love all that beeswax and everything coming through. But as a packer, I have to be mindful. Well, let me ask this question. Of all the experienced beekeepers in the crowd, how many of you have extracted honey and never, ever, ever had a splinter or something come off of a frame? Right. Okay. So, dead bees, dead bee legs, particles of beeswax, that's one thing. But a frame nail or a splinter or rock, a little grit, and yeah, you can get a little grit on your frames, that's quite another. So as a packer, I have to look at it from this point of view. I have liability insurance, but I don't want to use it. And if somebody gets a little piece of nail or a little piece of splinter up in their gum, guess what can happen? You can get sued big time. So we use these coarse filters to get out the stuff that's completely undesirable. Also, settling honey works. You don't really need to filter it. Honey's very heavy. If you just let it settle in a tank for a while, all the pieces of wood, dead bees, those things will float to the top. And if you have your valve for bottling just a little bit off the bottom, all the heavy stuff like frame nails, pieces of crimp wire off your foundation, and grit and rock and gravel will go straight to the bottom. So you can accomplish this with no filter at all if you just allow it to settle long enough. And okay, one more paragraph, then I'll finish up. Pollen particles, let's put this in perspective now. Pollen particles, if you're wanting to save that kind of stuff, generally fall between 10 and 50 microns, with occasionally one going up to 100. So if you use an 800, 1,000 micron filter, you're letting a lot of that stuff through, but you're holding back the stuff that we really don't want. That's how I approach it. A micron is also called a micrometer. It's 1,000th of a millimeter, or there's 4 zeros, 0.000039 of an inch. It's really small. I don't think the human eye can see anything below 30 or 40 microns. And a human hair, when I was young, my human hair might have been 75. Nowadays, I think it's something different, a little smaller. So with these big coarse filters, you're letting a lot of the good stuff through, but you're keeping out the stuff that could get you in trouble. And that's my approach. And I'm going to finish on something that I have to quote because I'll never read it word for word. I don't have it memorized. In this article, I said, finally, I keep getting away from the microphone, sorry. Finally, on a personal note, I admit that when it comes to processing honey, producing a quality product can sometimes be challenging, which is true, we all know that. There will be mistakes made and lessons learned the hard way. You may have to compete with people that have no problem with mislabeling and misleading the customers. I run into it all the time, I'm sure some of you do too. Let your quality and your service speak for itself, and remember it can take years to earn a good reputation, but you can lose it in a few seconds. And that's it. Thank you.